Great. Okay, so I call this the license to read. So in 1559, the Roman Index of Prohibited Books bans many, many authors from being read in Italy, largely because they're Protestant. And so you can't read Protestant authors in Catholic Italy. Punto. But what about the ones who aren't talking about things that are religious? Like, okay, maybe Catholics shouldn't be reading Martin Luther, but what about the ones that are writing books of pharmacopoeia, books of medical plants, books of animals, books of recipes? Physicians from all over Italy start writing to their inquisitors to say, we don't know how to medicate without Leonhard Fuchs. We need these books. These books are useful and they're important, and they aren't about religion. Well, maybe they are in certain ways, but we can change them in ways that will make them acceptable. And so this starts off a process of trying to make texts available at the same time that they're censored. And one of the things that you have to do legally in Counter-Reformation Italy in this period is to apply for a license to read those prohibited books. And this licensing system, reading licenses, lasts until Vatican II. So if you wanted to read Voltaire circa 1920, I think this is true, you'd have to apply, you'd write to your bishop, there's like forms by then, specific forms that you'd fill out asking to read the text and why, and certain types of texts are allowed to certain types of readers. And so I'm tracing that in particular, looking at medical texts, but I found lots of these. This isn't just like a couple cool physicians are reading. Got like 500 physicians in the early 17th century reading, 5,000 requests for licenses to read prohibited books. This is a huge bureaucratic project going on to ensure that people who are trustworthy are able to have access to materials at the same time that that other people are not.
And I think one aspect of that is that over a long period, there have been repeated efforts by, as it were, the police, the different forms of police, to produce something like a classification of readers. So, it's not just elite versus popular or Latin versus vernacular, although that may be the first cut. After that, you go into sometimes quite fine distinctions about, their geographical area, their gender, their educational status, age, right? All of these things, and they're subject to a certain. It's almost just like an academic discipline to a certain extent, without having an academic home, that to do empirical research onto communities to see how you cut up the world of readers, such that you then might say, we want to excavate a book in a certain way in order to not produce this effect on this group of readers, that kind of thing. Right. It can be quite sophisticated in a weird way.
Stuart, I remember you talking about the way people are categorized in Central America and some of the colonies there. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. So, of course, in colonial Latin America is a multi-ethnic society, a caste society with people of Spanish, indigenous, and African descent. Of course, there is a desire to sort of bolster orthodoxy among all of these populations, but these, the Spanish clerics who were in the Inquisition and in the colonial administration don't treat all of these groups equally. And of course, these groups have different, they might all have to some degree a common language in Spanish, but there's also, of course, indigenous languages and certain texts that exist only in indigenous languages. So the kind of that there's a kind of a division and a stratification of the censorship and the inquisitorial process that happens because of that. It's not only on the basis of age and education, although some of these things overlap with the caste categories.
Well, and I remember you saying that the line between indigenous and European is not as strict as we would imagine, because sometimes people of mixed race end up choosing to identify in one or another.
Well, yes, of course. I mean, this is a society that is legally highly segregated, but in reality, where there's a lot of contact and intermarriage, and also sort of forced sexual encounters as well. So you end up with a large mixed population, some of whom are forced into one ethnic category, but others who seem to be able to kind of move between them depending on the situation, and with the use of kind of dress and behaving in certain ways, dressing like a Spaniard, speaking like a Spaniard, doing things that's associated with being a Spaniard or being indigenous. And there are instances of people crossing back and forth over these boundaries, especially when they move between different cities, say. They're able to sort of reinvent themselves and sort of change their what they call casta, their caste status. So it is. It's actually quite a relatively fluid situation, although it is on paper it seems kind of more less fluid, more concrete.
Creating some databases which are extremely easy to access also diminishes our willingness to access other resources. Anyone who teaches in grade student papers observes which sources we see over and over and which sources we see rarely, because it's genuinely more work to access A than it is to access B. And in fact, we've all had the experience of being at a library and knowing we need a book, and oh, that book is in the depository, I can't have it until next week. I'll use the other book. The other book is here. But that how those structures of organizing information are inseparable from curating and shaping the new information that's generated by that information. Another one of these arenas where it isn't possible for there to be no information control. Any organizational system for information introduces some senses of information control. And a lot of what you've commented on, especially both in the Australian and the Chinese cases of having things be invisible from search engines, is people not thinking of the structures of information as themselves being information. That the Google search results are themselves a primary source, not just a secondary source. And that it does strongly affect what information is available for that search result to be differently structured, just as it affects it for a library catalog to be differently structured, or even an index to be differently structured. Let's imagine that you're taking a intro world history course, and you have your intro world history textbook, and it has an index, only the index doesn't index any communists or anything related to communism. You would never notice unless you went to go look that up, but it would make it 10 times harder to find the information about communism in that textbook as it is to find the information on any other topic in that same textbook.
Most of the works that you would think of as the influential works of the French Enlightenment circulated. They didn't circulate with official permission. What the regime was concerned about was information control. So that took the form of raising the price through selective persecution of booksellers, almost never of authors, of booksellers and book peddlers, which is what people used to do. Literally open their coats and there would be forbidden books. The system that the control of the librairie, the book trade in France, used in the 18th century was you would give official permission to books that met every standard of this threatens no one in positions of power in the status quo, but you would seek to raise the price of books that you allowed to circulate by a system known as tacit permission, permission tacite. It's not legal, it's not written. You have verbal or friendly communication. Yes, you can publish this. You will not get a royal privilege to publish it. You will not have the approval of a censor, but we're going to raise the price of it. And you could not only find those ended up being the most influential works of the 18th century that changed European civilization.
I wonder if I could take us in a slightly different direction, and that is because many of us are focused on censorship in the pre-digital, pre-algorithmic age, and the paradigm, I think, is a little bit different there in the sense that censorship requires an act of human volition. It requires a certain amount of mobilization of human labor to accomplish. And because of that human limitation, it makes it very difficult, and only rarely do we see censors recursively going through censorship decisions that were made decades earlier to revisit them and re-censor things, simply because they have enough on their plates right now to do. The algorithmic models of censorship that we're seeing in today's world change that because they're infinitely scalable. It's just a question really of processing power, and human labor is not as involved and is not part of it. So instead of having a set of discrete acts of censorship where people are reading a text and making decisions about, okay, what is not acceptable at this particular moment in time, and making deletions or modifications or excisions from the text. Instead, we should be thinking of censorship as a dynamic process, a series of infinite revisitations of a corpus, because algorithms can do that now in a way that humans were never able to do in the past. And they can revisit an entire archive, millions, billions of characters, roaming them effortlessly, constantly, to infinitely reshape them from day to day, depending upon what your priorities are, in a way that was never possible before. And so we get to this new model of dynamic censorship, of effortless mutability that is qualitatively quite different than anything we've confronted in the past. And it makes the record much more sort of difficult.
But the thing that I was going to get to about readers and the like is this, that there's a huge controversy that runs through the 20s and 30s, and it has its counterpart in the US as well, between, as it were, listening as entertainment and listening as experiment. Because at that point, radio was still a kind of technical scientific thing, where if you're a citizen scientist, you can be doing experimentation that might, in principle, actually advance the field. So there are hundreds of thousands, nobody knows how many, people in the UK, France, Germany, America, who see themselves as scientists. They have no particular qualifications, but they're doing research in the electromagnetic ether. And this research involves building a radio set and listening. On the other hand, there are also hundreds of thousands of people who are building radio sets and listening, but they're listening to the BBC or the networks, the emergent networks in America and that kind of thing. And the question is, how do you tell those two apart? Because the governments have this rule that they don't want to suppress science. So you don't suppress experimental listening, but you do want to sort of police and suppress, as it were, casual listening. And there are enormous internal debates, which are archived in the holdings, between figures like engineers and the BBC, about how you might tell the difference between an experimental listener, a scientist listener, and a casual citizen listener. At one point, I actually came across a letter from a BBC engineer where he's writing up to one of the managers in the BBC, and he says, well, it depends on the spirit in which you listen. If you listen in to the Beggar's Opera, this is the example he uses, and you enjoy it, then you should pay the license fee. If you don't enjoy it, you're doing science. So you're an experimenter, and you shouldn't have to pay, because science should be free. And they never actually solve that problem, because that's the closest that they get, and that's completely hopeless.
Several different elements here have made me start thinking about the city as a unit of measure of readers, also of producers of content. But at different moments in these many phases of different information technologies, an individual city sometimes is and sometimes isn't a very significant unit of measure for thinking about the puzzle pieces on a frame, as opposed to other units you can use to measure, such as an individual, a family group, a geographic region, a linguistic, a language sharing group, etc. When the Inquisition is banning everything from X city, or when people who want to exert monopolistic profits on publishing will ban everything from X city. But we had a discussion a couple weeks ago about news and the ownership of the news, and newspapers in the era in which the demographic of the readership of a newspaper is that city, right? It is Philadelphia. And it's in the interest of that newspaper to send its news on to other cities, because they will spread the fame of the information, they will send information back but no buyer of a newspaper in Philadelphia is gonna buy the New York paper instead, because that's not how the circulation structures in the late 18th and early 19th centuries in America operated, so that the city as a unit was a significant factor in shaping information control efforts, monetization of information, the way people thought about and measured information. And Usenet had a somewhat comparable structure in that it really had a very geographic networking space. I think there are still some arenas in which we see the city as a unit of readership become visible in censorship and information control, but not that often.